overnight here in New York? Or
just overnight. I have to go to Chicago tomorrow.
Chicago tomorrow. Yeah. And then on and until...
Then Newark the next day, and for 2 days in the Newark area.
Yeah. Boy, you're really...
Arizona the next day.
Do you keep this kind of a pace all the time? Or is this particularly...
No, this is just for now.
Yeah.
Because we had been planning this project for a year or so.
Okay.
And September 11th and other events just delayed it.
Yeah, absolutely. So well, I'm really glad we could get together.
We're honored to be here.
It's good to see you again after
Remember the old days.
Remember the old days. They're continuing. Yeah. Welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Bob Brown. Bob Brown's the director of the Kwame Ture Work Study Institute and Library, which is in commemoration and following the work of Kwame Ture, and it's a pleasure to welcome him to New York City and to Conversations. And Bob, it's good to see you.
We're honored to be here with you.
I wonder if you could, maybe just for the audience's viewing, we have some time, spell out, if you could, a little bit the personality of Kwame Ture, or who was also known as Stokely Carmichael. You were associated with him in a personal, secretarial kind of a close association with him for a considerable period of time. But he was an outstanding figure of our time. And maybe you could share maybe a little of your own background, where you're coming from, when you linked up with him, and link those two things together, and then maybe we could get to some talk about the library and also about, you know, the state of political affairs in this world as we talk on February 21st of the year 2002.
Okay. Well, first of all, we joined the movement in 1963 as a 15-year-old kid.
Mm-hmm.
Watching the March on Washington in 1963 with Dr. Martin Luther King and other forces.
Mm-hmm.
And we were too young to be able to go to the march. Our parents just would not let us go.
Yeah.
The next day we went and we joined the movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We looked in the telephone book and we could only find the Congress of Racial Equality.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the organization in which we joined, and really distinguished people, and the true history of CORE has not really been told.
Really, yeah.
The contributions of Farmer, of Floyd McKissick,
Yep.
of Bayard Rustin, of a whole series of people who were trained and came out of CORE since the 1942s.
The struggle was on and continuing.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think, another, very important point, people admit that, or at least suggest that 1960 was one of the years of the college students,
mm-hmm.
with the Greensboro, North Carolina sit-in and the sit-ins all over this country.
Mm-hmm.
But history does not properly record that 1963 was the year of the high school students.
Really, yeah.
When high school students across this country joined the civil rights and other movements.
Really, okay.
For example, in Birmingham, Alabama, more than 5,000 high school and other students joined Martin Luther King's and SCLC's program in Birmingham.
Mm-hmm.
And they, in fact, were the shock troops. And, once everybody else went to jail, it was the high school students who came as the second wave to keep the Birmingham boycott and demonstrations together.
Yeah.
Reverend Milton Galamerson and other forces here in New York City organized 1-day, 2-day school boycotts around struggles over the quality of education in New York City. A man named Lawrence Landry helped, who was former SNCC, ACT, NAACP, and other groups, organized a school boycott in, I guess it was October of 1963,
mm-hmm.
where 250,000 of us, just boycotted school for a day.
250,000 across the country?
Well, in Chicago alone.
Chicago
alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is these students who became the college student movement, who became the shock troops of, Dr. King's, Chicago Freedom Movement,
mm-hmm.
of the Black Power movement in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
It is that base, which was one of the bases out of which the Black Panther Party of Illinois has emerged. So that's the context in which I joined. And
I understand, yeah. But when you first went, 13-year-old, you say?
15 years
old
in 1963.
Yeah. And you mentioned their SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that name is synonymous with Kwame. So maybe you could, when did that get started, and what was its roots?
Well, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's roots comes from a conference which was held in April of 1960 at Shaw University.
Mm-hmm. Where is that?
In Raleigh, North Carolina.
Raleigh, okay.
In fact, it's my alma mater, where I graduated from school.
Really?
Years later from college. I got my bachelor's degree.
Where'd you get that in?
urban politics
Okay.
and behavioral sciences
Right, okay, yeah.
and whatnot.
Yeah.
But in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students sat in protesting the right to eat in the Woolworth's delicatessen.
Mm-hmm.
And this was part of a whole process that had been going on for 5 or 10 years, building up to this mass explosion.
Yeah, it was a real social...
that within 3 months of these 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina sitting in, some 35,000 students across the South had sat in restaurants and libraries and other places that we were excluded from because of segregation. And of that 3,500, I think more than 3,000 went to jail. And there were supportive demonstrations on the college campuses in cities throughout the country.
This is in the early 60s.
This is 1960.
Yeah, oh, in 60s.
The first 3, January, February, and let's say March of 1960.
Right, right.
A woman named Ella Becker, who had a distinguished career and contributions in the movement, working with the NAACP's youth wing and whatnot, convened a conference of, I guess, something like 300 or 400 of the cream of the student crop at Shaw University on Easter in 1960. And you have a number of people who we now, Julian Bond was there, who's now head of the board of the NAACP, Marion Barry, who was for a moment the mayor of Washington, D.C. So these students came to meet to discuss how they can continue the student wing and phase of the movement. And out of that conference, there emerged a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which from 1960 through at least 1968 were in fact the shock troops.
The shock troops.
The shock troops of the movement.
Okay, what is that? What is, you've used that term a couple of, when you say the shock, the ones who are out there on the cutting edge of confrontational insistence upon changes that some people are saying would be nice if it could happen, but they wanted to make sure that it did, or something like that?
To use a very bad parallel.
Yeah.
The Marines and the Green Beret.
Oh my dear. Yeah, right.
You know,
and the SEALs thrown in.
And the SEALs.
Yeah.
In terms of that corrupt U.S. government's approach, you know, that denial of human rights and that they use throughout the world.
That's
it's a bad example.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Within that example,
serious stuff.
These are the troops who go in first.
Yeah.
These are the troops
who was right on the.
He was right on the line.
Right,
these are the forces who go behind the enemy lines. You know, who bear the brunt of the initial, you know, sacrifices and struggle and suffering.
Yeah, in these voter registration drives.
Voter registration drives.
Dogs and things like
that. Even the right to ride on a Greyhound bus.
Right.
In 1961, for example, we could not sit and ride on a Greyhound bus because of segregation in interstate transportation. So Core launched the Freedom Rides. But just the right to get on a bus in Washington, D.C. and travel all the way to New Orleans.
There was something blowing in the wind, and as Bobby Dylan used to say and everything, we had Kennedy as the president. We had John Kennedy. We had Robert Kennedy. Did the political context, I mean, the political leadership and the executive branch, or how do we account for the tremendous stirring of the civil rights movement that came in the 60s like that? It was just an idea whose time had come. Would it have come no matter who was in the White House? Was there political support for it and so forth? You know what I'm saying? Trying to get a sociological fix on that amazing watershed period.
I think it would have come to some degree or another, regardless of who was in the White House. Because first of all, I think it had something to do with the baby boom. You had millions of youth who were born, you know, between, say, 46 and 64, whatever the demographic age set for the baby boom. And you can, I mean, as a lightweight sociologist by academic training, you can see that as demographically the youth reach certain ages, by the time they reached elementary school age, you had a crisis in the elementary schools because you had this big explosion of students, especially of color, in these schools that had not been, any new schools had been built since the 1930s. And with segregation, you had no African, no black teachers and whatnot.
In the absolute absurdity of the context that they were asking this nation, this world to accept the basic premises of, just became so obvious.
So I think it has to do with the coming of age, you know, and maturity biologically and politically of youth. And you can see in the colleges and in the high schools and in the elementary schools I think it has to do something with the national liberation struggles.
Yeah, that's right.
That had
there
been
was
being
feedback
waged around the world.
Anti-colonial sort of, there's a tie-in, I think. Yeah.
I think it also had to do with the emergence of the socialist bloc at that point in time. Because many of the things the United States government was forced to do was because of international world opinion. To give you just one example, this whole notion of this World Conference Against Racism that was just had in Durban.
Yeah.
The United Nations treaties that called for the convening of that conference comes out of an international treaty against racism and racial discrimination, which the United Nations passed in 1965.
I think Malcolm wanted to take the United States to the UN in order to violation of human rights and wanted it was serious.
There's a history of our people. I mean, Marcus Garvey took them to the League of Nations. W.B. Du Bois took them to the United Nations in 1945 and 54. Paul Robeson.
These are the roots,
the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, even SCLC and Martin Luther King, because we are part of an international community.
So there was that support.
Yes, and what affects people in the United States, positive and negative, affects people in the world. And whether we admit it or not, what affects people in the world ultimately affects people in the United States, good or bad. So it's these forces that were swirling in the 1960s.
Let me get off track a little. How do you feel now? We'll come back to that, right? But now here we are, the civil rights agenda is still very much before us, the human rights agenda. How do you feel generally about things now? 2002, keeping in mind that we will go back and pick up the running narrative, but what's your general feeling about the state of affairs as far as these
To me, we are back to where we were in the 1950s and early 1960s.
You really think that? Right?
I really think
nationally?
That. Nationally, domestically, the crisis in our community today, the crisis in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia, the conditions of the people are worse today than they were in 1950 on every level. On every level. Yes, we have more middle class. We have more numbers of rich people. We have more numbers of people who, for a lot of reasons, I think. But when one talks about the people on the ground,
nationally and internationally.
Yeah,
and you got to protect. And Kwame, he went back to Africa and Guinea.
He saw it, and you should see the conditions in Guinea, in the country where Kwame lived since 1968 and where he died.
That's where the library wants to be set up.
So we're going to build the library. And the conditions in Guinea tonight are worse than the conditions were for the mass of the people in 1957 and 58 when the country became independent.
I wonder if it's the case with the mass of the people, as you say, of color, or the colorless people like us.
Not just.
I'm just making a joke.
Yeah, but not just of color.
For everybody, in a sense.
You need to go to Paris and to London, and not into the tourist part of town. Go where the white working class and where the white poor are living, and see how they are living in Paris.
So it's worthwhile talking about class.
It's a class question.
Yeah, right.
It's a class question.
Okay, so we've deteriorated in a way. We want to go and pick that up and so forth. Maybe we can go back to the 60s and that sort of thing. Because we had a number of figures. Martin King was huge. Malcolm X, the Nation, this kind of thing. These were there. And then Stokely.
Yes.
Now, where did he come on the scene? Where did he come from? Fill it in a little bit. And that you, let me just say parenthetically, or maybe not so, that you were working closely, right by his side for decades. So you know the man as well as anybody, and I wonder if maybe you could,
well, Kwame emerged out of the student movement. Kwame emerged out of the student movement. As a student in the Bronx High School of Science in the late 50s, he was involved in all of the progressive struggles and movements that the Bronx High School of students, volunteered. They volunteered to go to the civil rights offices to lick the envelopes. They went with Bayard Rustin on the demonstrations against HUAC in 1960.
HUAC, remember that?
Yes.
HUAC? I'm sorry, yes.
And then he became part of the student movement.
He became part of what,
the student movement through Howard University. And every summer he would volunteer to go, into the South to help teach people to read, help register people to vote.
Voter registration.
Voter registration.
He really put it on the line.
He really was that. He was
dangerous.
Dangerously, when you would be killed for registering to vote.
And, yeah.
When you had to sneak into town. You couldn't call a press conference and saying, we're coming into town, because the press would go tell the sheriff and go tell the Ku Klux Klan, and you would get arrested, you would be killed before you came into town.
Yeah, all in the name of the law.
All in the name of the law.
Yeah.
Because what you were doing was illegal. It was.
You think he'd be branded terrorist by our current situation?
Yes, he would.
They would be called terrorists.
Yes.
The civil rights guys who sat at the counters and so
they
forth.
Were called
they would be labeled terrorists within the current context of political thinking.
They were labeled as outside agitators, as provocateurs, as terrorists then.
Well, I remember George Washington was called a terrorist by George III. Nelson Mandela was labeled a terrorist.
Yes, he was.
I mean, that's just to sort of bring up the terrorist world.
And some of the leadership that helped create the State of Israel were branded as terrorists in their times as well. Begin and the Stern Gang and other forces.
Yeah, right.
So it just becomes a weapon that people use.
It's a rhetorical thing. And for people that are trying to change things, maybe in a way.
If you threaten me, then I label you a terrorist. So as to be able to isolate you and justify the things that I want to do to you.
And decide that it's saying that we represent all that is legitimate and right in the universe, or the legalistic way in which the world is seen. They see themselves in a certain camp, and the people who are trying to challenge or change that can be conveniently called terrorists, because they don't necessarily play by the rules that the legitimacy would have said in the South. You come down here and you rightfully are going to be hung for sitting at a counter or something, and they would say that's legitimate.
It is Bull Connor who called us a terrorist, who called us outside agitators because we simply wanted to sit in a restaurant.
Yeah, well, you had a lot of nerve trying to go and get a piece of pie.
And you know, the fact is, the true bandits, the true murderers, the true criminals of the world have to label everyone else as that in order to protect and to hide themselves.
And it's continued.
It's continued.
And it's getting worse.
My personal view is that George Bush and Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice are the arch devils, the arch criminals of this period.
Axis of evil?
The axis of evil.
Isn't that something called the axis of evil?
The axis of evil.
Yeah. You see it that way.
I see it.
Yeah.
I know Condoleezza Rice personally. I know her father personally.
She's very bright.
She's very bright. I have no disrespect for her. But how intellectually, but how can she sit in a room and justify dropping bombs all over people? Okay, if someone has committed a crime, if someone has done something wrong, you send the police to get that person. You don't bomb whole communities. You don't bomb whole peoples just to get one people and then justify it.
I've been thinking about that quite a bit over this time, because, I mean, it's gotten worse through time, I think, in the modern experience, to where the civilian casualties of wars between the power heads of state and so forth has just mounted through time. We think even in the Second War, Dresden firebomb, and you know, this kind of thing, or the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed civilians. So if the powers that be use, and we have atomic weaponry, the United States, and we do threaten and use that as muscle,
as bullets,
and have threatened to use that as a sort of terrorist notion. And isn't there's something with people that are in this supposedly legitimate power relationship to existing states, to where the use of their power would have to be called, I don't know what the euphemism would be, but they act in a way that is terroristic toward masses of people and so forth. They experience that in the civil rights movement. Those were terrorist acts enacted against people who were trying to change by people who supposedly were in a position of power. And that may be a metaphor for the world as we begin to look out into this 21st century, perhaps.
Yes. They are the bullies of the world. And they don't just bully their enemies, they also bully their friends. They don't want anyone...
The system is a bullying system.
It's a bullying system.
It's an authoritarian, bullying, top-down authoritarian system, which characterizes virtually all the states of the world.
And it's intrinsic. It's institutionalized. the country was built on the genocide against the indigenous people of this country.
Sure enough.
They came as terrorists to take the land, to kill the people, to put smallpox in their blankets.
They did do that.
Some of the first biological warfare was committed by this government.
That's right, threw blankets over the wall.
Against the indigenous people. And then they came to Africa. And the history of the villages that were destroyed, of the lives that were destroyed, in order to capture 42 million people.
42?
42 million.
Because you really researched it.
The United Nations and UNESCO, these are not my figures.
Yeah.
W.B. Du Bois said 100,000. Toni Morrison said, million, sorry. Toni Morrison said 60 million. Other people have said 11 million. I'm just simply using the figures that the United Nations accepts and publishes documents and books and the information which you can find on their websites, so that if the figures are wrong, they're not my figures.
Yeah, I see, yeah.
They say between 21 and 42 million people were somehow involved in the total...
Just uprooted?
Uprooted.
Middle Passage?
Some of them were enslaved. They suggest that 50% of that whole population, women, were enslaved in Africa.
Yeah. What about that?
And whatnot. It's a hidden story.
Yeah.
Nobody,
that Africans enslaving Africans?
Africans enslaving Africans, but not just that. Because Britain was the head of the slave trade. Corporations set up by Britain, especially by James II, Charles II, and Elizabeth. They set up companies whose job it was to go and steal the land. We know them as Hudson Bay Company, as Virginia Company, the so-called, the Dutch West India Company, the so-called original 13 colonies. They came to take the land, and they had to kill the people to take the land. Then these same companies, England passed 300 capital offense laws within a very short of time. If you was homeless and vagrant, it became a capital offense.
Capital offense?
Capital, which meant you could be killed.
Where?
In England.
In England.
300 laws were passed like that, just like today.
What years are you talking about?
This is the 1600s. And it is these laws and the contradictions in Europe at that time between Britain and Ireland which resulted in so many people being sent as settlers.
Indentured.
Indentured servitude.
It's like a form of slavery, yeah.
Yes. Convict labor. Georgia and Australia. Oglethorpe. They were convict labor.
Yeah.
Prostitutes. Women who were impoverished and forced, to participate in prostitution just to feed their family.
I think
And it is those reasons and religious persecution, France against the Huguenots, forces against the Quakers.
I have a line I use a lot, in terms of trying to understand this whole ball of wax that we, the whole human experience. And James Joyce, it's my favorite line. And James Joyce had Daedalus say, "History is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken." One keeps waiting for the alarm clock that's going to awaken us all. But it really is, from the standpoint of the folks particularly, it's been a long, hard struggle, hasn't it?
Yes.
In the face of systems that were in place that in their essence were not legitimate by some standard of universal understanding of human or human rights, or even ecologically considered human rights. We've got big change that we have to face up to that has not yet been faced up to, I take it, in your assessment.
Let me just taking up on this question of long, hard struggle. Right before Kwame made his transition, I was in the hospital room with just me and him.
This is in Guinea?
In Guinea in 1998, and he looked at me and said, "Bob Brown, when I met you in 1966, and we started working together in 1967, I promised you nothing but long, hard struggle, long, hard suffering, and victory in the end." And then he looked at me and said, "Did I keep my promise?" Well, after I finished laughing, told him, "Yes, you did." Long, hard struggle and long, hard suffering. And then I said, "But you also promised victory in the end."
And that's the part I wonder.
Not necessarily in our lifetime.
Oh, he said that or you did?
He said that.
He said.
He said that.
Not necessarily.
And then told him, and Kwame, you kept that promise as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, we've had many victories in our lifetime. Many victories, most of them small, but many victories. And
you're talking you and he. You're talking
me and him. But the true victory.
You think of yourself as having been in league with Kwame in a singularly important way. You were in touch with a lot of people. You've been in touch with a lot of people in the movement.
I've been
but
fortunate
Kwame
in my life.
particularly was a particularly close ally, or
Kwame is the one who I worked with consistently from 1967 to 1998, and still work with his mother and family on the library today. But I've met most of them. I know Jesse Jackson.
Yeah.
Longer than I know Kwame Ture.
Yeah, were you involved with him way back when?
I met Jesse Jackson in 1965 when Martin Luther King brought him to town. My godfather is also married to, one of my godfathers is married to his aunt.
I see, okay.
So I met Jesse when he came to town with nothing but, you know, one pair of underwear and one pair of blue jeans and a bunch of kids.
Yeah,
and
right, yeah.
And so that, and when the history is written, you know, I've helped Jesse in many different plateaus in his career and his mission, even if I didn't totally agree with him. You know, I thought it was something for the people.
Were you in touch with Dr. King or Malcolm?
I met Martin Luther King many times in 1960. I can't say I know him and was that close.
Yeah, I understand.
But he came to Chicago in 1965 and in 66 with mass demonstrations and meetings and rallies and stuff in 65, 66 with the Chicago Freedom Movement. And I marched in the streets with him and Dick Gregory and other forces in 1965. That's where I met.
You were just a young man?
16, 17 years old.
Just getting started, right? Yeah.
So I can't exaggerate and say I know him. I met him. I know we also cussed him out and disagreed with him.
You did? Because you were youth. You were saying, do something more. Or do something,
he was, for example,
nonviolent, or what was it?
I'll give you one example. He came to Chicago once, I believe, in 1967, and he was, after the rebellions, and he was saying that we must be nonviolent, we must be nonviolent, we must be nonviolent. And we said, okay, but we have draft notices. We've just been drafted to go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
What do you...
It took him quite a while to come around.
You asked him, what do you tell us to do? Because certainly if you tell us to be nonviolent in Chicago, in this country, then you must also tell us not to go to the war.
And he had a long time before he finally did. When he did, he really came out in spades. But
he said that he agonized for more than 2 years.
That's right, yeah.
On the silence and the betrayal on the principles in which he believed. And when he came out and forcefully, he had done it before, but forcefully at Riverside Church,
Riverside, right,
to oppose the war on April 4th in 67. He, if I remember correctly, gave 7 reasons why he came out against the war. But one of those reasons was that he said every city he went into, he met angry young black men.
All right, that was you.
I was one of them.
Yes, I know.
And he said, you know, that, you know, who saw
the hypocrisy.
And the hypocrisy, who were not committed to nonviolence as a principle and a way of life, who were more committed to Malcolm's position any way necessary. And he said that I have to speak out now on behalf of those angry young black men.
Yeah.
And he said because if he did not speak then,
things would get out of hand.
He also said he could never speak to us again.
Yeah, right.
How can you tell me to
do? You know what he's talking about.
I know, it's a matter of principle. If you say nonviolence is a principle in America, then you must also say that nonviolence is a principle in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And you must oppose violence on any and all sides.
In that thing with Malcolm and Malcolm and that was very real to you. The tension between those two views of things. It's been dramatized for the general public and everything, but it was real.
I never had a chance to meet Malcolm. You know, Chicago was a base for the Nation of Islam and for Malcolm.
Yeah.
And every time he would come to town, I mean, we followed him on the Cup Show and in the newspapers.
Yeah.
But because I was involved in the civil rights side, I never really went over to that side of the movement. But clearly, when Malcolm was murdered by the U.S. government in 1965, we marched through the streets of Chicago and across this country, naming parks after Malcolm, naming schools after Malcolm. We didn't ask no permission. We just tore the signs down and put up paper signs saying this is Malcolm X. And it's a whole history of that.
I heard you say the government. Do you think the government, you know that for a fact?
I know that for a fact.
Yeah, because that's...
Because even...
It wasn't people from the nation, or were they opted by the government?
But let me explain it. Let me explain it.
That's a huge mystery.
No, it's not a mystery.
It's not a mystery.
Even if they were members of the Nation of Islam, it is a public fact that the Nation of Islam was infiltrated by the FBI and the CIA to the highest level, including the National Secretary, John Ali. And I say that because a man named Louis Lomax wrote 2 books in the early 60s, one of them at least before Malcolm was killed. I forget which one it was, but he had 2 books, When the Word is Given, and then the second one was called To Kill a Black Man. And it's been so long since I read it, but in whichever one was printed 2 years before Malcolm died, Louis Lomax said in that book that John Ali was an FBI agent at the highest level.
Now, who's John Ali?
John Ali was a person who Malcolm X had helped recruit and train, and who Malcolm...
Was he involved in the Audubon?
Yes, he is the one who ordered the hit. He is the one who ordered the hit. He is the one who did it. And Louis Lomax told Elijah Muhammad 2 years before Malcolm was killed that John Ali was an FBI agent, and Louis Lomax was told this by a man named, I forget his name, Val, it come to me, but he was a top black newspaper reporter in Chicago, owned one of the black newspapers. And this man had been told by Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa passed the word on. But for whatever sets of reasons, they couldn't move on these people. Because sometimes you know you're infiltrated but can't do nothing about it. It is John Ali, working on behalf of the FBI, who ordered the hit. And this is public.
And he was with Elijah?
He was the national secretary for Elijah. But Elijah he was taking orders from the FBI.
Is it? That's really something.
He was taking orders by...
Somebody ought to make a full-scale, Will Smith or something, make a full-scale movie of that.
Yes, they should.
If that's the facts and everything, they should do that.
If it is not the facts, then Louis Lomax lied. And then other forces.
What would the official position of the United States government and the FBI be about the assassination of Malcolm?
Their position is that it was an internal feud.
Yeah, it was an internal feud because there was all that bad tension between Malcolm.
But then there also are FBI documents admitting and saying that they exacerbated those tensions and feuds, and seeing the murder of Malcolm and the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah as victories.
Kwame Nkrumah in Africa.
Yes.
Yeah.
And certainly we can see today when they proudly stand up and say, we're going to kill these 35 people, we're going to freeze their bank accounts, we're going to do this, we're going to pursue them to the ends of the earth. Are we to believe that they are only doing this now? Did they not do the same things against Kwame Ture? Did they not do the same things against Malcolm X? We have the files.
Yeah, that's right. Kwame Ture and Kwame Ture and Malcolm, and there was this Hoover, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they would do everything they could to try and prevent the rise of a messianic figure among the folks. You had Malcolm, you had Kwame also, who was founded for 40-odd years, and has a huge file of FBI that's part of your library, I think. You
should come to my little apartment down in Washington, D.C.
I should like, yeah.
You can't get in the place. I have FBI documents sitting over here. I have CIA documents sitting over there. Late at night when I'm laying in bed and can't go to sleep, I read National Security Council declassified documents.
Yeah, it's coming out.
It's coming out.
Yeah.
I have letters from the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library sending me a 30-page bibliography, just not the document, a 30-page bibliography listing declassified government documents were the United States government investigating, sabotaging, harassing Kwame Ture?
They really were.
They really were.
And the powers that be were really concerned about the, just say, use the term, because I know you can talk to this, about the rise of a black messiah, or a messiah. A person that would be really effectively able to lead the people in a serious challenge of the way things is.
That the words come from a document that J. Edgar Hoover wrote on August 27, 1967. Essentially, the document said that the black nationalist movement was once again in this country coming over to the mass. It is J. Edgar Hoover who helped destroy Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And he thought he had finished the nationalist movement in the 1920s. And now, 40 years later, this movement re-emerges with even more intensity. And he said this movement has gone over to the mass. And this movement,
worrying.
It's a threat.
If ever the folks get themselves together, we could be in deep doo-doo.
And it said that the masses of youth on the college campuses, in the ghettos, are flocking to this movement.
And the spark and the core of that was, let's say, over the civil rights thing with the blacks, let's say, and everything. But it included, it could reach out, particularly with the Vietnam, it could reach out to a whole lot of other massive people who are going to sit down and say, wait a minute, we need a better system than one that you guys are running. Is that what it was?
That's what it was. And then Hoover said, we must prevent. He ordered the FBI, every FBI field office in this country and legates internationally to do everything they can to come up with imaginative and hard-hitting ideas and proposals to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify this nationalist movement, recruit the youth to it. We must do everything to diminish their respectability and image. We must divide them. We must everything. And they did. And they did. They ordered COINTELPRO. And this document is very clear. It said that Malcolm X could be this Messiah. But he is the martyr of the movement today because they killed him 2 years earlier. They said Elijah Muhammad could be this Messiah, but he is less of a threat because of his age. This is nonsense because Hoover was older than him. His age has nothing to do with it.
Be there forever.
Khomeini overthrew the Shah of Iran and the CIA laying on a prayer rug because he was an elderly man. So age had nothing to do with it.
Interesting, But this is their analysis.
This is their analysis. It then said, even more ridiculous, that Martin Luther King could become this black Messiah if, and this is exact quotes, if he abandons his obedience to white liberal doctrines of nonviolence. Now, this is nonsense because Dr. King told us when we came to meet him about the war in Vietnam in 1967, that if every Negro in America turned against nonviolence, he would be nonviolent to his death. And we told him when we told him. It's a moral principle. It's a moral principle for him.
I think the same with Gandhi in India. It wasn't just strategic.
And we told him, when the white folks kill you, we will build a funeral power for you. We promised him. We will burn, and we did it 1 year later. So Hoover, he was afraid. He was afraid. If you look at the files, he was afraid of Kwame's relationship to King.
Okay, now we're getting down to Stokely now.
Kwame was like a little brother to King. And when different forces would try,
you're not talking about Kwame Nkrumah. You're talking about
Stokely Carmichael.
Stokely Carmichael.
When Stokely, like a little brother, big brother, little brother relationship. Forces would come to Martin Luther King and say, you must denounce Stokely Carmichael.
Who would say that?
Certain forces who were bringing money in. Stanley Levinson, who was one of his advisors.
Because Stokely was seen as radical?
As radical, as black power, the position he took in support of the Palestinians. He's the first one to know that
we need power, black power.
For different reasons. He came out in support of the PLO in 1967. He came out against the war in Vietnam, and they would come to King. We have transcripts of of meetings. You know, we have transcripts of FBI wiretaps of telephone calls where different forces would advise King, you know, to denounce Kwame, Stokely Carmichael, and King would say no. Let me give you one clear example.
Please do.
Shortly after Kwame became chairperson of SNCC, Kwame was arrested in Atlanta for alleged participation and inciting a riot.
Kwame?
In 82, 83, I think.
So we're talking, he was still
He was Stokely Carmichael.
Okay, just to get that straight.
He was arrested
Yeah.
for allegedly starting a riot in 66 in Atlanta. And they went on trial. And Kunstler, William Kunstler, who was a great lawyer here, flew into Atlanta to be Kwame's defense attorney. We have a tape, you know, an FBI document, which is an alleged transcript of a wiretap between King and Stanley Levinson, where King asked Levinson, no, what position do you think I should take if the media comes to me if Kwame is convicted? And Levinson was saying, I think you should distance yourself from him. And King said, I will not. He said, if...
Before the decision was in.
Before the trial.
Yeah, before the trial.
He said, if Kwame Ture Stokely Carmichael is convicted for this charge of rioting, and the press comes to me, I would tell them that the system is the problem for creating a Kwame Ture.
Yeah. All right, that's interesting.
He would not.
Yeah.
When he was developing his position against the war in Vietnam, Martin Luther King, Kwame in different places, in different interviews and times, would always talk about the time when Martin Luther King called him up and said, I want you to be in church tomorrow. And Kwame would say, look, I got a meeting, you know, blah, blah, blah. And King would say, no, I want you to be in church tomorrow.
Tape of that.
You know, and then Kwame, you know, they would dance around, and then King would say, I'm going to preach a sermon against the war in Vietnam.
Oh, he'd be there.
And then Kwame would say, I'll be on the front row. I'll be on the front row. And he had no suit. He had no clothes to wear, so Kwame would go borrow some clothes from Cleve Sellers. And then Kwame would look at me and say, find it. Well, we found it. We now have pictures of Kwame and Cleve sitting on the front row in Ebenezer Baptist Church. We do not have it, but we have a bibliographic citation because Army intelligence bugged the room, the church, the sanctuary, and filmed and videotaped the sermon and Kwame. So we have an FOIA request to Army intelligence.
Oh, yeah, to get a documentary together of some of these things, right?
We want the phone call. It's one thing for Kwame to say from his memory. And maybe mix up the dates and the times and the years. But it is something else to say, okay, now here is an FBI document, and here is a Army document, that while it differs in a lot of details, it corroborates that the phone call was made, the invitation was made, he did go to the sanctuary, King did come out against the war in Vietnam.
And some of the forces that we were looking at Kwame as in messianic or of leadership terms, a spark, a sort of Spartacus kind of position that they saw him, and they targeted him for the same reasons they would have targeted Malcolm.
For the same reasons they targeted Malcolm and so many other people. And they also targeted him because of his associations. How does a 25-year-old kid be elected chairperson of a bankrupt organization with no money, and within 1 or 2 years travel all over the world, meeting Ho Chi Minh, meeting Kwame Nkrumah, meeting, Sekou Touré,
from which he got his name,
meeting Fidel Castro, meeting Ben Bella of Algeria,
meeting Muammar Gaddafi,
meeting later Muammar Gaddafi. How does this person who
there must be something there.
It's very clear. There was a whole generation of people who had been in the movement and who had done similar things prior to him, and they simply adopted him. It is Shirley Graham Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois's wife, who sent Malcolm X to Ghana in '64 to meet Nkrumah. It is Shirley Graham Du Bois who sent Stokely Carmichael
To meet in Nkrumah.
to Guinea,
Okay.
to meet in Nkrumah
Excellent.
and Sekou Touré.
Yeah. That's where he got his name from.
That's where he got the
Kwame
name.
Ture, yeah.
And it is Shirley Graham Du Bois who looked at Stokely Carmichael and said, you need a wife, Miriam Makeba, you need a husband, marry each other.
Really? That's how it happened?
Because, you know, the elderly women play matchmakers.
Yeah,
they
yeah,
say,
they
oh, I
do.
got a
Yeah.
daughter for you.
Yeah.
You know, oh, I got a niece for you. You know, I got a son. So that's part of the social role that they play.
And Stokely felt it, and he went in, when did he take up residence, as it were, or in Guinea?
In
When did he
1960.
make that?
In 1968.
68.
68,
Okay.
because in 1967 the United States government made the decision to kill him. And we, yes,
Now
and
you got
we,
that document.
we have the
The
document.
United States
Government
You
made
got
the
names
decision.
associated with
We
that?
got
or-
names: Lyndon Baines Johnson, Nicholas Katzenbach, Richard Helms. We got the documents.
What does the document say?
The documents say that Stokely Carmichael is a threat. He must be stopped at all costs. The documents say we order your department to do everything you can to stop him.
It's not necessarily assassination.
Let me give you some examples. First of all, they ordered Ramsey Clark
God bless him.
to bug him, to arrest him.
He was Attorney
And
General then.
Attorney General.
Yeah.
And Ramsey Clark, in paper after paper after paper, said, I cannot arrest Stokely Carmichael for just speaking. He has to do something.
Yeah, right.
And we have no proof. And Lyndon Baines Johnson called Ramsey Clark all kinds of names.
But he had appointed him.
He had appointed
He
him.
had appointed. That says
But
something.
he told him,
And Baines.
get Kwame, get Stokely
No,
Carmichael.
it didn't necessarily. If I may, it didn't the same as assassination.
I'm coming to that.
Oh.
I'm working up that way.
Oh, okay.
I'm coming quick.
Okay.
Let me say, this is just, let's start with the Justice Department and Ramsey Clark. He ordered Ramsey Clark to find ways to arrest him.
Well,
He ordered Ramsey Clark to deport him and take his citizenship.
and Ramsey wouldn't go along.
And Ramsey would not go along with that.
Yeah, Ramsey
Okay,
Clark
that's
was
one.
Tremendous
He
voice.
ordered the army, every place Kwame went. Army sniper rifles were on the rooftops across the streets with the crosshair on Kwame's head, waiting for the order to kill.
Now you got evidence of that. I mean, you're not just
William Pepper, a distinguished lawyer from Europe, William Pepper wrote a book called Orders to Kill, which is about the alleged role of Army intelligence in the assassination of Martin Luther
I
King.
hear in there alleged, and
I
hear,
said alleged.
Yeah.
I said alleged.
There's a lot of rumors and things.
I
You
said
know
alleged.
what I'm saying?
I heard you. I said alleged. I believe it to be true.
Okay.
And in this book, Pepper allegedly documents how Army intelligence surveilled King, bugged King, how Army intelligence sniper teams followed him all over every place he went, waiting for the orders to shoot to kill.
Maybe they were protecting.
Maybe they were protecting, but he was killed anyway by an alleged lone crazy assassin. So if they were protecting, they weren't doing it too well. They didn't protect Kennedy too well either.
Now Stokely,
But in this same book,
President Kennedy.
in this same book, Pepper has incident after incident after incident where Army intelligence was surveilling conversations in hotel rooms on whatnot between King and Stokely Carmichael. And they claim at the famous Huey birthday rally in February 17, 1968, when 10,000 people was in Oakland Coliseum, and then the next day 5,000 in the LA Coliseum, and Kwame was the keynote speaker to free Huey Newton.
Things are building.
Pepper says it was Army rifle teams on the rooftops with the sniper hair on Stokely, on Rap Brown, waiting for orders to kill.
Right.
Now, my problem is that Pepper does not have footnotes in the book.
Yeah, it's a good.
So I have asked specifically from every branch of the United States federal government, 75 agencies.
Mm-hmm.
I go
You
day.
promised Stokely you do that, didn't you? Or was his mother you promised?
It was my assignment for 20-some-odd years.
On his deathbed.
I went to him, I said,
you
on his
filed it January
deathbed.
1, 1999.
I went to Kwame 10 days before he died, on November 5. I said, Kwame, there's another assignment I haven't finished. He said, finish the damn assignment. I said, but you don't know, you don't even know what I'm talking about. He said, I'm a sick man. I said, you don't even know what I'm talking about. He said, file the FOIA request. I said, I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
I came back with a document. I told him, sign it. He said, tell my mother to sign it. I told him, no, you're going to sign it, because this may be my death warrant. And he signed KWA. And I took the document to the U.S. Embassy in Conakry for them to notarize it. And the first ones I filed the FOIA request on was the U.S. Embassy in Conakry, Guinea.
Freedom of Information.
Freedom of Information Act. And I filed it January 1, 1999.
Right.
And so far,
And you're getting stuff back.
we're getting stuff back.
Linear feet of stuff.
The FBI said
They had a
had.
pretty big file.
They said they have 80,000 sheets of paper that they are now combing over to see what they're white or black out.
Yeah.
And then I can have the rest for 10 cents a page. And I wrote them and told them, you have an office in Honolulu, Hawaii, that said there wasn't no files on Kwame Ture.
No.
Tell them to go back and look in this office on this date. Because Kwame Ture was in Honolulu,
So you're
Hawaii.
on the case.
I was.
You've been on the case
It's
for
my
decades.
job.
Yeah. And there was very worry about him as being the potential spark that would really set off a massive
And they
revolution.
were worried about him up to and including his death and since then. The State Department has sent me 20 documents, including the U.S. Embassy's report in Conakry, Guinea, on Kwame's funeral.
Yeah.
And on the death certificate, when a U.S. citizen die abroad, you must file for a death certificate in order to be buried, even outside this country. And on the last line on that sheet that says a certificate of death of a U.S. citizen who dies abroad.
Now, he kept his citizenship?
He kept his citizenship,
Yeah.
but he had citizenship in Guinea,
And in Ghana?
in Ghana, I think even in Libya. And
I know he was very close with Muammar Gaddafi. Yeah.
they gave the Trinidadian citizenship back to him before
They
he
did.
died in Trinidad. But on the last line on this birth certificate, it said U.S. government agencies who are notified of death. It checked, so Social Security was notified, so no one could claim Social Security benefits.
Yeah.
He was not a member of the military, so the Veterans Administration was not notified. He was not a member of working for the U.S. government, so they didn't notify civil service. But it said, we notified the FBI and the CIA of his death in writing.
Yeah. Because we know they got a lot on him.
So they cannot now come and tell us that they don't have a report. They give us some little 2 or 3 pages of nonsense and think it will satisfy us.
Stokely Carmichael was amazing. As I told you, you were close to him. I had a chance to be with him quite a considerable bit. He was funny, and he was
very
warm-hearted, one of the most warm-hearted individuals I've ever in all my life met.
His smile could light up a room.
Absolutely charismatic beyond the man. I mean, somebody like that, I just loved the man. He was fantastic. And so what I managed to get to the memorial service a couple of years ago uptown, and that sort of thing. But he's missed. And God bless you. And his mother also is involved in trying to get this library together. And maybe we could touch on that. We're coming up close to the end. So talk a little bit about the Kwame Ture Work Study Institute and Library, which you are the director of, and trying to put together the legacy of Kwame Ture in a way that can be put effectively to use in terms of the future evolving events and so forth.
Basically, Kwame had his books and his papers that he in his possession.
Lots of books. He was well
he had over 1,700 books, and these were just the books who were left, because kids would come through the house, he'd give them books.
Yeah, I know.
So these were just the books that were left. I mean, he had literally hundreds of thousands of sheets of paper, letters and correspondence and files and reports and memorandums. And he said to her that I would like this to remain in Guinea. And she promised him
These are all his effects. They were
this is all he had.
Yeah.
I mean, he has no other property.
Yeah.
You know, all he has is a reputation and name.
Did he come to really think of that as a home base?
It was his home.
That was, and he felt that way. Comfortable with you.
It was his
comfortable
home.
with that, right? He'd come here once in a while.
He come here once in a while to go on speaking engagements, to recruit, to raise money for our organizations, but
Yeah.
it was his home.
Yeah.
In fact, when I went to Guinea and 3 months or 4 months before he passed, he looked at me and said, "Bob Brown, it has taken me 20 years to get you back home.
Home.
Home. This is your home, not just my home. And you haven't visited Guinea, and you haven't visited my house in 20 years.
Yeah.
And he said to me, what's this about a round-trip ticket in 30 days? You ain't going nowhere. Sleep over there in that hospital bed till I can clean the twins out of your room."
Did he know Louis Farrakhan?
He knew
Louis put together the
He
Million Man
knew
March,
Louis
and
Farrakhan well.
Yeah. And you know him well. Yeah.
I know him.
Yeah.
In fact, we have FBI documents that allegedly documents when Kwame Ture met Louis Farrakhan.
Oh, really? That would be good.
You know, in 1966.
There's a couple of big figures, yeah.
When Kwame became the chairperson of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of his first official acts was to fly to Chicago to meet with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And that is where he was introduced to Muhammad Ali and to Louis Farrakhan. I haven't even went to see the Muhammad Ali,
Yeah.
the prize fighter.
Yeah.
How can you do a movie of Muhammad Ali that's serious and not mention Kwame Ture and Stokely Carmichael in the movie?
Well, he was right there.
They were like three triplets.
You don't like the movie?
I haven't seen the movie.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I have my friend.
I haven't seen the
I have
movie.
a friend in there, Michael Bend. He had a role.
And I respect Ali. I know.
Yeah.
I will never forget one night that Kwame and I were going through the Detroit airport late at night, and we couldn't get a flight. And we looked up and we saw this big commotion and noise over on the other side of the airport. And Ali was in the same airport, stranded.
Yeah.
And just to see them two playing like two little kids.
Playing, that's the
wrestling, you know, blah, 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 you know, jokes and whatnot with the whole airport watching and laughing.
Yeah.
I remember another time there was some university that we were 2 or 3 hours late.
Really funny, yeah.
Kwame 2 or 3 hours late getting to the university because of some nonsense with these airplanes. And Ali had promised to meet us at the university. And Ali held over 2,000 or 3,000 kids saying, "It's the fight of their life. It's the fight of their life. You know, when he comes here, I'm going to whip his ass." I mean, and these kids, like, we were 3 hours, 4 hours late. And, 2,000 to 3,000 kids stayed there waiting to see when Stokely Carmichael came in the room.
One of the bad things, we got to put together some archival stuff on all this.
Please.
Thank goodness for the library, and good luck on the work, and the best to his mother, right, who survived Stokely. And thank you very much. I'm really sorry.
And we want to thank you for all the work that you have done.
It's good to see you again. It's
okay,
been
we
too long.
appreciate it.
Let's keep it going. Let's keep in touch with another. Your pleasure. Had exceptions. Bob Brown, and he's director of the Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture Work Study Institute and Library. It's located, I guess, in Chicago now, but also temporarily,
and back in that Fund of Illinois.
Yeah, and it also is in Guinea, the selected country that Kwame had selected, and he's somebody that we ought to keep track of. Happy to bring you those exceptions. Please tune again next week. We'll be coming back then. Bob, thanks.
Thank you again.
Very much indeed.
Okay.
So he could go on for hours. The man was wonderful, to my perception. You know, I really. But you were in touch with him all along.
Oh, I know him.
Yeah.
I know him.
How's his mother holding up?
She's okay. She's 80.